it. If you don't want your likeness recorded or you don't want your voice recorded, please keep your cameras off and your microphones on mute. So we have a good talk today, I think. An interesting topic that we always get questions about. So Dwayne Joseph is our Ag and Food System agent in Kent County, and he has done all kinds of research about cover crops and weed management. So today he's going to talk to us about using cover crops for weed management. So your screen looks good. You can take it away, Dwayne.
All right, thanks, and good afternoon, everybody. Excuse me. So, like Emily mentioned, my name is Dwayne Joseph. I'm the ag agent up in Kent County. And today we're going to talk about how we use cover crops for weed management, right? So, a lot of my work looks at weed management in different systems. We mainly focus on integrated pest management, integrated weed management. So, I'll hopefully just summarize some of the stuff we've done, hit you guys with some, cover crops 101, kind of hopefully it's a review, and then we'll see how it goes. Hopefully we should be done in half an hour-ish. Um, okay, so this is basically the slide basically says because University of Maryland is we're funded by the USDA and federal monies. We have to put out this slide basically stating that if anybody feels any basically I'm blanking right now, but if there's any discrimination, that's what I'm looking for. Any discrimination, there's an avenue where you could have that heard. So just a quick overview, whenever I listen to talks, I always want to know where I'm headed, right? So whenever I give a talk, I always kind of give the audience an idea of what we're going to cover. Like I said earlier, we're going to hit some basics with cover crops. We look at it for weed management, and then I'll go over quickly some ways that we've used it in the field, so some practical means. So we'll look at some studies. And then at the end, if we have time, we'll go over some scenarios, right? To basically tie everything together. So whenever I do talks, I always like to start off with a quote, right? For two main reasons. One, I like it. Um, and the second one is because back when I was in grad school, whenever I used to travel, I was listening one time to this financial guru guy, and he kind of scared me into, you know, basically making a budget, right? And what he said that still sticks with me, still rings with me today, and that's why I put it up here is that, if you're not managing your money is managing you. But he didn't say it that calm. He screamed it out through the speakers, right? And that kind of, I was like, whoa. So, whenever I give talks, I want people to understand, hey, weeds are a problem, right? It's not anything that should be taken lightly. If you're not managing them, they're managing your crop. So hopefully that scared you guys. I know I didn't shout it out. I know it's lunchtime. We don't want to startle anybody, but um, you know, basically we need to understand that weed management is important. So why do we need to control weeds, right? One, they compete with the crop, right? They compete for light, for nutrients, for water. That's one of the main reasons. Second reason, it reduces yield, right? Through that competition, you'll get a yield reduction. If you're a commercial farmer, a yield reduction means you take a hit in your pockets, right? So we want to manage weeds for that reason. Another important reason to manage weeds is because they vector viruses. Okay, so they can be that bridge or that vector for viruses that would eventually affect your crops. Also, when it comes to pesticide application, they impede that. So imagine uh, um, weed canopy over your crop, you spray, it basically blocks those pesticides from getting onto the leaf where it's supposed to be, and also on the ground. If you're applying a soil applied type herbicide, you might have issues there. Aesthetics, right? Weeds are ugly. If you have some nice neat rows, if you plant in vegetables, weeds aren't very pretty to look at, even in on your lawn, right? You don't want to see those weeds in there. But the next one we're gonna kind of focus on honing is on the harbor pest and disease. And in the next couple slides, we'll see how exactly weeds harbor pests and also diseases. So like I mentioned, weeds, they host pests, right? So if we think of weeds like milkweeds, prickly lettuce, mustards, they are hosts for aphids. So aphids like to um, hang around those types of weeds. And with those weeds in your field, they would eventually transfer into your crop. When we think of brown marmorated sting bugs, again, milkweeds like to be hosts for these pests, and also mustards and grasses. Recently, we've seen this in my county, spotted lanternfly. I don't know where each person is located in Maryland, but depending on which county you are right now, either this has been an issue or it's going to be an issue. So when it comes to spotted lanternfly, the tree of heaven is its host. And again, um, these weeds host different pests. And then the other types of stink bugs, if you think of lamb's quarter, Russian thistles, these host stink bugs. And then finally, when we have grassy weeds, so think of foxtails, crabgrasses, we tend to get a lot of field mice or rodents that kind of hide in there. So when you look at the effect of weeds and the damage from the competition, and that's related to various factors, right? So when we look at weed composition, so we think of the types of weeds that are present in the area. So the type of weed that you have present would determine the type of competition and how the magnitude of that competition that's going to take place with your crop. Also the weed density. So basically the more weeds, the greater impact that you would see on your crop. Um, Something we don't really look at is for the growth stage of the crop, right? So depending on your weeds, the weed establishment, the weed density, and the timing of those weeds, when they emerge, when they're present, you might have issues and damage related to your crop, right? So if you think of before establishment, before your crop establishes, if you have weeds there, it will impede your crops. There's also a period that's called a critical weed-free period. And that's a period that's been scientifically through research determined where different crops need to remain weed free so that you wouldn't have any issues further down, later down when it's time for yield, right? With the critical weed free period, it varies depending on crop, it varies depending on the types of weeds you have, and it also varies on the weed pressure that you have, right? So it's basically a whole symphony. It's a really hard period to try to figure out. But the good thing is there's literature out there on different crops, which kind of basically gives you that timing where you need to keep that crop weed free so that you don't reduce your yield by more than 10%. And also when we think of the developmental stage, right? So when these crops are basically putting out flowers, reproductive parts, which are basically economically viable, we don't want any weeds competing with that crop then, right? Because what would happen is you'd have a reduction in yield. And also weeds affect the method of harvesting, right? If you harvest in row crops with a combine, you would have an issue. If you hand weeding, let's say you have some cucurbits, cantaloupe, cucumbers that are sprawling on the ground, you would have weeds. It would basically impede you from seeing those crops when they're ready to be picked, and also have issues also finding those crops. So weeds basically are a problem when it comes to uh, harvesting and the way that you harvest, and also your efficiency when it comes to harvesting. So it won't be a IPM seminar if I didn't bring out the IPM slide, right? So most of us already know what IPM is, should know what IPM is, and basically is like using a toolbox filled with different methods to tackle whatever pest problem you have, right? So instead of just relying on just one tool to combine to control any pest you have, you want to combine as many strategies as possible, right? And your main goal with IPM program, integrated pest management program, is to manage pests effectively while using as few chemicals as possible, right? And the main reason we want to use fewer chemicals is that we don't want resistance to develop. So in this talk, we're going to look at the cultural means. We're going to focus on cover cropping and how cover crops can be added into an IPM program to manage weeds. So what is a cover crop, right? So a cover crop basically is a crop that's not harvested. So instead of harvesting it, it's planted to basically do different functions, right? It protects the soil. Like we'll talk about today, it suppresses weeds. They also add nutrients to your soil, and they support beneficial organisms, right? When it comes to cover crops, they're planted either during the season or off season between the main crop. So during the season, we'll mention that a little early later. During the season, they could be grown as a living mulch. Between the main crop and off season, they could be grown as either a dying mulch or sometimes even a living mulch. But we'll, in the next couple of slides, we'll kind of hone in on that. So why should you grow a cover crop? One, it prevents soil erosion, right? You don't want to leave your soil bare. If the soil is bare, like it's been doing for the past couple days. Today is a good day, but earlier in the week it rained a lot, right? So imagine that soil, nothing covering it. It rains. Where would that soil end up? It will wash off, end up in the bay, um, or end up in ditches or wherever. So we want to grow cover crops because we want to prevent soil erosion. Another big thing is we want to suppress weeds, right? And again, as we go forward, I want to expand on this one because we're going to hit on this in the next couple slides. It enhances soil fertility just through having that root system in there, and also the type of cover crops we put in there. If we put a legume, or if we put a brassica, all of these would help enhance soil fertility in different ways. And again, we're going to hit on that in the next couple slides. Promotes beneficial soil microorganisms. And also it attracts pollinators and beneficial insects. So before you plant a cover crop, you want to ask yourself a couple questions, right? So first you want to know, what is your goal, or what goals do you have for that cover crop? So it's always good to take out a pen and pad, write it down. Like one of my mentors, one of my advisors told me, if it's not written down, it's just a suggestion, right? So you need to write whatever goals you have for that cover crop, you need to write them down. Also, another thing you need to write down is what cash crop will follow that cover crop, right? So you need to figure out, hey, what am I going to grow? And from figuring out what you're going to grow, then you could tailor what cover crop you're going to put before it. Then you need to ask yourself, how are you going to establish that cover crop, right? You need to figure out how you're going to plant it. And then how are you going to terminate it? Because if you leave it sometimes, depend on the type of cover crop, you'll have some competition with your cash crop. So there's always, you need to figure out, hey, how am I going to get rid of this cover crop? So you need to set goals for cover crops, right? And these goals will basically depend on various things. So let's say you have compacted soil, or you have soil that has microorganisms or pest issues in the soil. You want to grow some brassicas, right? So think of radishes, canola, or mustards. And these help with soil compaction, and also they act as biofumigation agents, right? Brassicas, radishes, they all have long taproot systems, and these systems break up compaction, and these systems help when it comes to having healthier soils. Another goal you might have is, you have soil that doesn't have much nutrients in there. So if you think of, you want some nitrogen, some natural nitrogen into your soil, you could grow or you could plant some legumes, right? Legumes, they fix nitrogen, and when you turn those back under into the soil, you get those added nitrogen credits into your soil. So legumes like peas, beans, clovers, veg, these are really good for fixing nitrogen. Weed suppression. When it comes to weed suppression, you need cover crops that are high biomass forming cover crops. So when it comes to high biomass type cover crops, cereals are the best types to go. So rye, wheat, barley, oats, these types of high biomass forming cereal cover crops are really good when it comes to weed suppression. And if you're in the summer, if you grow in vegetables, even fruits, you want those pollinators around so that they could pollinate your cash crop. So you want to attract them. So cover crops like buckwheat, clover are really good at attracting pollinators, and that's mainly because of their flowers. So um, when you think of setting these goals, when you look at your soil or whatever issues you have, you could look at these and go through this list and figure out, hey, I'm going to use this, I'm going to use that cover crop to kind of meet that goal that I have. So when it comes to your cash crop, following your cover crop, um, you want to, if you asking yourself, are you direct seeding or are you transplanting, right? Your cash crop. How are you going to put it in? So if you're going to direct seed your cash crop, you want to stay away from high biomass cereal cover crops. So like I mentioned earlier, stuff like rye, wheat, triticale, oats, barley, those high biomass forming. And the reason why you want to stay away from those is because they can leave behind too much residue, right? And with all that residue, it makes it harder for your equipment to work more effectively. So and also you want your seeds to establish. So you don't want that high biomass forming cover crop. So if you're gonna direct seed, you may want to stay away from cereal cover crops. However, if you're gonna transplant, you may need that high biomass, right? So you need that weed suppression from a mulch. So if you're transplanting, then a high biomass cover crop would provide excellent weed suppression by basically smothering the weeds and reducing that competition. So by doing so, those cover crops, that mulch will give your cash crop basically give your transplant a better chance of survival and establishment right before at transplant. So when it comes to establishing your cover crop, you could go various ways. So you could direct seed them with a grain drill or whatever equipment that you have. The good thing about direct seeding is you get perfect seed to soil contact, and that's what's really needed when it comes to germination, right? Or you could broadcast, or you could rake, broadcast those cover crops and also rake them in. Um, that you won't get as good of seed to soil contact as direct seeding. But again, if you rake it in effectively, you would have a decent chance of having a good stand of your cover crop. Another thing that's important when it comes to cover cropping, especially if you're not using any machinery like a grain drill, is to prime your cover crops, right? So you want to prime your seed before you transplant it. And what that is basically you want to soak it in water or in a compost tea. Um, when it comes to the different seed sizes would dictate the how long you would prime your cover crop for. So if we have, let's say, small seeds like clovers or brassicas, you want to prime those for about between 4 to 8 hours. That's what's recommended, right? If you have any medium-sized seeds, like let's say ryegrass or oats, it's recommended that you prime those between 12 and 18 hours. And when it comes to large seeds, so think of peas or beans, these you want to prime for at least 24 hours. So the recommendation is between 18 and 24, so 24 hours at the most. These are really effective. I remember when we were trying to grow sickle pod. So sickle pod is a weed. It's a very troublesome weed down south. Um, but it has a really hard seed coat. So we were trying to grow them in the greenhouse and it just wasn't, we were getting like really low germination rates. So what happened was we needed to prime them first, right? So we needed to soak them overnight. So that, that seed could take up that water and basically break the outer coating so that it could germinate proper. So same type of ideology when it comes to your cover crop. If you want good stands, if you want good emergence, you want to prime your cover crop prime your seeds before you plant them. So you planted your cover crop. Now you need to figure out how you're going to terminate it, right? Um, When it comes to termination, basically means killing your cover crop. There are a variety of ways to kill them. If you go in the chemical route, which is the easiest route, you could use a herbicide, just spray them with a herbicide and they'll die. Or you could mow them, that would terminate most cover crops. Another method is the roller crimper, which is this little implement here. What this does is it basically snaps the cover crop at the stem. A lot of cover crops, especially rye and different cereals, need to be terminated at a specific time or they'll just pop back up. So with rye, the recommended time is at anthesis, so that's when it's putting out flowers. If you terminate it before, if you roller crimp it before or after that, it might not die, it will come back. So um, also tillage is another good way. Winter kill, so if we think of the brassicas, tillage radish, those if we have a harsh winter or typical winter, well, not recently, but if we have a typical Midwest, not Midwest, sorry, a mid-Atlantic winter, they should winter kill, but for the past couple of years, we've been having issues where the winter was really mild and a lot of these radishes weren't winter killing. Um, Also, if you go in small scale, you could mow it and then tarp it. Another small scale issue method is to smash it down. So basically mimicking a roller crimper and then you tarp it. So all these methods would get you to terminate whatever cover crop that you have growing. So when we think of cover crops, I mentioned a lot of single cover crops, but mixes are really good, right? When you have a mix, you could capture different characteristics of different types of cover crops, right? So the mixes are like a multitasker for your field, right? They let you get multiple or achieve multiple goals with just one planting, right? So for example, if you mix, you might want to, let's say you want to improve your soil health, you want to improve, um, you want to attract beneficials, you want to suppress weeds all at the same time. No one cover crop would be able to do all of these. So that's why you want to have a mix, right? Um, Mixes, the minimum we recommend for a mix is a three-way mix, and I'll go through what that three-way mix looks like. But I've heard guys doing 6, 9, even 12-way mixes, right? In fields. It all depends on their goals and what they want to achieve from that cover crop. But when it comes to a basic mix, we have three main varieties or three main cover crops that we recommend. One is a legume. And again, going back to what I mentioned earlier, you want that to fix nitrogen and also for soil health. So a vetch, a clover, peas, any beans. Also, legumes will attract, especially in the summer. These would have the attractive flowers, and these will attract pollinators to your field. Another type of cover crop you'd want in there is a grass or a cereal. And these would be in the mix basically for weed suppression, right? They produce all that biomass. At termination, that biomass would be mashed down and would form a nice mat over the soil, and that would suppress any weed emergence or any weed germination. And also in that mix, you want a brassica. And the brassicas are like a tillage radish, canola, mustards. And again, for soil health, to um, to reduce that soil compaction because they have these long tap roots. And also, if you have any soil pest or any soil issues, they're good biofumigation agents also. So when it comes to cover crops, you could use them as in two main categories, right? You could use them as a living mulch, and I'll go over what that is in the next couple slides, or you could use it as a dying mulch. So when we think of a dying mulch or a terminated mulch, basically it's a cover crop that is grown and then terminated prior to or after your crop planting, right? There's this method that's been gaining some traction called planting green, where they terminate the cover crop after, so probably a few days or in some instances even weeks after they plant their cash crop, right? Also, if a terminated mulch, it suppresses weed growth by acting as a soil cover. You cover the soil. You basically reduce the stimuli from the sun and also that warmth that weeds need to germinate. Also, it helps prevent soil erosion, like we mentioned earlier. You have something covering the soil without the soil being bare. When it rains, you have your soil staying where it's supposed to be. Retain soil moisture, again, through that covering of the soil. And it also may reduce herbicide inputs, right? So if it manages weeds, then you don't have to spray as much herbicides because you don't have as many weeds emerging. So um, the other method is as a living mulch. So what a living mulch is basically a cover crop that is grown between an established cash crop. So your cover crop basically grows together with your cash crop during the season. Um, and by growing together with your cash crop, it suppresses weed growth by acting as a green cover. Again, it prevents soil erosion by basically having something on the soil with a root system. It improves your soil structure, and it also benefits and promotes biodiversity, right? So it enhances beneficial insect habitats. It brings pollinators to your field, and it basically helps out in those particular ways. In a lot of my research, a lot of the research that I've been a part of, we're looking at red clover as a living mulch, right? And there are various reasons why we're looking at red clover as a living mulch. One is because it's very fast growing, so we plant it in the fall. By springtime, it comes up before the weeds, and then it forms that cover and it prevents weeds from germinating. Also, it's pollinator friendly. It has all different types. It has these pretty red flowers that attract pollinators. It's nitrogen fixing. It's a legume. It's not like competitive, so depending on the crop that you're growing, so if you're growing something like an upright crop, let's say like tomatoes, um, the red clover wouldn't tower over those tomatoes, right? So it doesn't like compete, so that's another good attribute of it. It improves your soil structure. And also we are looking at it because it's understudied, right? There's a lot of research on the rye, the grass type cover crops, the cereals, but not much on red clover. Okay, so just gonna switch gears a little bit here. So let's look at some of the ways, the practical ways which we have used cover crops in both as a living and a dying mulch in our different research projects to figure out, basically to optimize or to evaluate how they would perform as in a IPM system and also as a weed management tool. So to understand polyculture, we first need to know what monoculture is, right? So I'm guessing everybody knows what monoculture is. It's basically when you grow just one type of crop in a field at a time. So basically, I'd say 99% of agriculture, right? So think of acres of corn, acres of soybeans, whatever, wheat. So that's basically monoculture, right? It's simple to manage. but it can lead to more pest disease or soil problems over time, right? And that's basically because there's less diversity. So in steps polyculture, right? So polyculture just means growing different kinds of crops together in the same area instead of just planting one. So it could be different cash crops, it could be multiple cash crops, or it could be a cash crop with a cover crop. So a lot of our work is looking at moving away or looking at using polyculture as an alternative and to a monoculture system and seeing that, trying to make it be as effective when it comes to IPM as a monoculture system. So polyculture cropping system suppresses weeds. Um, they promote soil health, so they increase organic matter, they reduce erosion, they improve the soil structure. And that's basically because there's plant diversity, right? There's more plants, there's more diversity. So one of a good quote that I always like to add to my slides is from Hartwig and Ammon, and they said that increasing plant diversity in fields supports beneficial arthropods by providing essential resources. So let's look at some of the research that we've been doing, and so I think we're gonna hit probably 4 or 5 research projects, but it's all one slide, so it won't take much time. But basically what I want to show is the evolution of our thought process when it came to how we got into looking at a polyculture system versus a monoculture system, and how that has evolved over time and where we are today, and how we're going to move over through this in the future. How we're going to make that movement in the future, right? So I was part of a lab called the Hooks Lab um, at UMD, University of Maryland. The professor behind that lab is Rudy Hooks. Emily was also part of that lab. And his work basically, so he's an entomologist. His work looks at, how these monoculture, polyculture systems can bring beneficials and different insects into the cropping system. And by doing so, it would reduce the amount of pesticides that we add, right? Um, my role on the team was to look at it from a weed science aspect, right? Because I'm a weed scientist, he's an entomologist. A lot of these systems, a lot of these, there's there's a path that crosses when it comes to these disciplines. So it's always good to look at these two together. So one of his students, Hannah, she had a project where she looked at red clover as a living mulch, and she looked at how that had an effect on arthropods and natural enemies and cucumbers, right? In entomology, natural enemies are basically good bugs that help control pest insects. So they could be predators like, let's say, ladybugs, or even tiny wasps that parasitize pests, right? So her work was basically looking at how a polyculture system would manipulate the pests and also the natural enemies in that cropping system. So what Hannah found was that when she grew red clover with cucumber, she found that there was a decrease in pest, right? So there were less pests, and that's mainly because there was an increase in natural enemies. So those natural enemies were preying on those pests, and that was reducing the pest numbers, right? And she was looking at that from a polyculture system versus a monoculture system. So in the monoculture system, there were way less natural enemies, way more pests, and the inverse was true in the polyculture system. But one thing she didn't quantify was weeds, right? They were just looking at insects, but she noticed that there were way less weeds in the polyculture system versus the monoculture system. So then a couple years later came Damien to the lab, and Damien was looking at basically, again, a polyculture system. This time he was looking at it in cantaloupes. And what he found was that the aphid numbers in Virginia wild rice. So he was looking at using cereal cover crops as a living mulch um, in those cantaloupe systems, right? And he was comparing that to the standard system, which is a monoculture system. So he found again that there was a drop in aphids, and that's mainly because there's a rise in natural enemies in the clover. But this time they quantified the weeds, right? So they looked at the weed abundance and density, and they confirmed that the weed abundance and density went down. Most recently, we had Leo. Leo just graduated. He just graduated in the summer. Yeah, Leo just got his master's in the summer, looking at his project where he looked at, again, red clover, but this time his project looked at red clover grown on, not red clover, sorry, cantaloupe grown on plastic in a standardized system where whatever a cantaloupe farmer would use, right? So sprays, pesticides, herbicides, the works versus a system with a polyculture system where we didn't add any herbicides and we didn't add any pesticides. So in Leo's work, again, he saw that beneficial arthropods went up. The tridivores went up, and what the tridivores are basically any organism that feeds on dead plants or animals or other decomposing organic matter, right? So think of earthworms, beetles, millipedes. These break down waste and they recycle nutrients back into the soil, right? So an increase in that in detritivore abundance is a good thing, especially when it comes to soil health. But Leo again measured weed abundance and density, and again we saw that it went down. So one of my colleagues, Kurt Vollmer, he's the weed extension specialist with Extension, University of Maryland. He had a project where he was looking at seeding spring seeded cover crops. So just to go back, the other cover crops we were looking at were all fall seeded. But this time we're looking at spring seeded, right? And the idea behind those is that, a farmer didn't have time. He wanted to lay plastic rows. And then after he laid the plastic rows, then he would seed that cover crop in the spring. And that would be his way of managing weeds between those rows, right? And what Kurt found was that weed control increased when they had a cover crop present. So some of his studies, he looked at two different cover crops. He looked at rye, um, he looked at spring oats, and then he looked at a mixture of those two, right? And he also supplemented that with some herbicides, some soil applied herbicides, and also he used herbicides to terminate those cover crops. When you look at weed density, when he had a cover crop present, that went down. And also crop yield, when he had a cover crop present versus without a cover crop, we saw that the crop yield went up, right? So that's a really good system right there. So we control the weeds, and then we had a boost in crop yield. So awesome. So let's look at this time just a method where we mix. So in the previous examples, the previous studies, we looked at either a living mulch or a dying mulch. But in this study, we looked at mixing, right? Both a living mulch and a dying mulch and using those together to in an integrated weed management plan. So in this vegetable system here, if we look on the left, we growing together in alternating rows. We have red clover, and on the outside we have, or in the inside, we have cereal rye. We grow them together in the fall, and what would happen is in the spring, we'd terminate with a roller crimper, like I mentioned earlier, adventices, we'd roller crimp, and what that would do, that would terminate the rye. It would knock the clover down a little bit, knock it back, the clover would come back, it won't die. Um, but what we would do is, and after we terminate, we would just go straight into that mulch and transplant whatever vegetable you want, right? In this instance here, I think this is okra, or it might be eggplant. But we've done it in various systems, different vegetable systems, right? The good thing about it is we get some good weed suppression. throughout the season. Um, but also we need a crop that is very competitive, right? So a crop that would form a canopy and form it quickly. So that's a way that we're looking at mixing a living mulch and also a dying mulch. And again, that's how it looks. So this here is summer squash. So that's like, it's almost time. We could see some flowers on there, some small immature fruit on there. So if you look here, you would see really clean rows, which is very, very good. All right, so as I close, you may be asking, you may be saying, okay, Dwayne, you gave me all of this thing about cover crops. They sound good. Um, but I can't harvest them, right? And I can't make money off of it. So then what's the point? How am I going to afford this? Well, I'm glad you asked, right? Um, so there's cost share opportunities. There's different resources. There's cost share opportunities. Um, NRCS has really has two really good programs that they have where they help fund cover crops and soil health practices. So the first one is EQIP, and EQIP stands for the Environmental Quality Incentives Program. And what that program does is it helps producers install new conservation practices. And also, if you have any resource or that problems that you want to address, so like let's say weeds or even erosion, so that program would help fund that cover crop practice. Also, there's the CSP, which stands for the Conservation Stewardship Program. And this program is the one that rewards farmers who already have implemented those conservation practices, right? So if you already have those conservation practices implemented on your farm and you just want to enhance it, then CSP would help you fund that cover crop. The Maryland Department of Agriculture also has a Maryland cover crop program. And this one is a cost share, but this one only supports small grains cover crops, and it has to go in after the cash crop. A lot of producers in my county, I know a lot of producers in Maryland, the large type producers kind of rely on and use the MDA program. Also, you could go to any of your soil conservation districts. So each county has a soil conservation district. If you want more information or if you want support and planning, and if you want to sign up for any of these, either the federal program or the state-run program. Also, extension, as us at Extension, we have research-based recommendations. So a lot of our faculty, a lot of our agents, we do research, cover crop research, and we could give some really good recommendations. We also have on-farm and rec trials, which we do and we demo to the public. I think a couple times a year. I know the last one we just had one in, well, not just, but in May, we had one in Queen Anne's County. So if you have any questions, you could, contact me, contact Emily, Hayden, or you could contact your local extension office and we could be able to point you in the right direction. All right, so what's the time? Okay, we have a couple more minutes for scenarios, right? So we have two scenarios, and I like to put in scenarios because it basically helps pull everything together, right? If I've rambled on for 40 minutes, so I guess hopefully this makes sense and these last scenarios will help you put everything together. So let's say you're an organic farmer, right? You're organic grain farmer. After you harvest corn in August, there's always a field that gets loaded with pigweed right before frost, right? And that's an issue I have in my county of several of the organic farmers. Fall tillage isn't an option because it's usually too wet in your area by then. What do you think you could do to suppress those weeds and prevent a bigger problem next year, right? So if weeds go to maturity, they release seeds, they add deposits to the seed bank, then you have problems for years to come. So what would you do in that situation? So one, you want to establish a fast growing fall cover crop, right? So think of cereal rye, barley, triticale, These can help close the pigweed germination window. Again, think about what I said earlier. You have anything you have covering. So whatever background you have, weeds are going to exploit that. So if you want to cover that soil, you're going to reduce the amount of weeds and reduce that germination window. Also, it shades the soil and competes with the weeds for space and resources. It suppresses winter annuals. There are winter annual weeds that come up. And also in the spring, it will keep the soil cool and suppress weed flushes, right? So in the spring, those cover crops are gonna go, they'll get big, and they'll suppress any weeds from coming up. So fewer weeds, fewer mature weeds, you get less seed bank deposits, you get less weeds over time. So it's a good thing to have a cover crop. Okay, last scenario. So let's say you run a small U-pick farm. By midsummer, the row middles start filling up with weeds. They compete with the crop. They make the farm look messy right when the customers are about to visit, right? You want your farm to look good and presentable. Um, Tillage or mowing between the rows is difficult without damaging the trees or running over the plastic, right? You just employed some summer workers. They don't care. They just got their license. They're out there running around and hitting all your trees and messing up your beds. Um, and running and mowing and running the mower and the tiller so many times it gets expensive, right? Think of gas costs. So how do you think you could manage those weeds in the alleys? What do you need to do to manage those weeds in the alleys? So you want to establish a cover crop, right? But this time you want to do, let's say, a living mulch. So you want a low-growing cover crop or a living mulch in the row middle. So think of something like a spine fescue, white clover, or a mix of the two. These form a dense canopy that is low that you could walk over. It outcompetes ugly weeds, and it keeps the alleys neat, right? Also, the living mulch, it would reduce the amount of times you mow. It's a low-growing living mulch, so you wouldn't have to mow it as often. You probably wouldn't even have to mow it once you get some foot traffic on it. It would prevent soil erosion. And when it comes to footing, it would improve that and also the aesthetics, right? It would improve the aesthetics. It would also attract some pollinators to your field. So I think that's it. It was nice speaking to you. This is my name, Dwayne Joseph. That's my contact information if anybody wants to contact me after. And I don't know, Emily and Hayden, if we have time for any questions, but I'll try to answer these.
Thank you, Dwayne. I think we have a little bit of time for questions. First, I just wanted to say in the chat there, I did place some links to our IPM webinar playlist on YouTube, and you can go through and sign up for any IPM webinars. I also put a link to our pesticide CEUs. So if you need pesticide CEUs, please follow that link. It is time dependent, so don't wait, 24 hours to fill it out. Please fill it out now. And if you have any recommendations for future IPMs, you can go onto that link and recommend them as well. I think we did have one question in the chat. It's from Crystal. Says, what about white clover as a cover crop? Landscapers consider it to be a weed, but can it serve as a ground cover for between corn and okra rows?
Yep, definitely. So actually next year, we just planted it actually this year. So I'm looking at using a PGC system. So it's a perennial ground cover. So I'm mixing rye with different clovers. So not rye, sorry. I'm mixing fescue. I'm mixing hard fescue with different clovers. And in there, we have a white clover in one of those mixes. And the reason why, one, I don't know, I have a bunch in my yard. My neighbors probably look at me crazy, but it's a good ground cover. It attracts beneficials, it stays low. People call it a weed. It depends on who's looking at it, right? Might be a weed to you, might not be a weed to me. So it's an excellent. I did some trials this year, and the white clover came out really good. I looked at 10 different clover varieties to see how they would do in Maryland and when we should plant them. And white Dutch clover was one of those varieties, and it did pretty good. So Yeah, you could definitely put it in between okra. In between okra, we've done different red clover mixes. So we've done Freedom red clover. We've done Alsike, that's a white clover, and we've done Alice clover. So yeah, yeah. So short answer, yes.
It was mentioned in the chat that long term, 2 to 3 years, white clover can become aggressive by spreading.
All
So,
right.
is it best to use it for a perennial ground cover, or do you think it can be used for an annual as well?
So if you use it, it's mainly for a perennial, right? And again, that's why I mentioned about knowing your goals and how you're going to terminate it, right? Again, it could, if you're organic, then you might have an issue. But chemical, if you want to use chemicals, then you could always take care of it with chemicals. You could always spray it and it would die. Um, so again, that's why you need to, like one of the slides said, you need to figure out how you're going to terminate that cover crop.
Okay. And then a follow-up is how long do you tarp and what kind of tarp do you use to cover and kill your ground cover?
So I've never tarped, but I spoke with an individual down in Virginia. He tarps, he said about 2 to 3 months, depends on the temperature. But he would tarp for about 2 to 3 months to terminate his cover crop.
And I think most people are using silage tarps, correct?
Correct. And he was using those silage tarps. I think you could also use you could use any of the tarps that prevent so anything dark that would absorb heat, or I guess a white one would reflect heat. Um, but yeah, he was using those types of tarps, and also the vinyl. I know you could use the vinyl one also, but don't quote me on that.
Mhm. Okay, any other questions? Well, thank you very much, Dwayne, for talking to us about cover crops. And as Emily mentioned in the beginning, this will be posted to YouTube in hopefully a week. So if you want to review anything that was said or send it to a friend or family member, we will post it to the IPM list in on the UME YouTube page. So thank you very much for everybody attending, and I hope to see you at the next IPM webinar. Thank you, Dwayne.
Oh, thanks. All right, take care.
You too.